The rain hit harder as I stood on her porch. No call, no hug, just her waving through the glass. Still, I didn't move when the umbrella snapped backwards. Just watched her silhouette sip wine like I wasn't her mother. As the water soaked through my cardigan, I memorized the smell of lemon oil on her perfect door. While she curled up inside with jazz and silence, I let the cold remind me what love doesn't look like. The same hands that once raised her later circled her name in red ink. Removal, not revision. That's when I knew. Some storms don't pass. They get notarized. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. By the time Eleanor Mercer turned onto her daughter's street, the sky had soured into a dull bruise, and the first crack of thunder rolled low across the Tennessee hills. Her windshield wipers dragged a tired rhythm, smearing more than they cleared, as if even they had lost their patience. The parking lot at Dr. Halperin's office had flooded slightly, soaking the hem of her slacks before she'd even made it to the car, and now, with water pooling behind her knees and her fingers aching from the cold, she felt every bit of her 72 years. She parked at the curb in front of Camille's house without honking or texting ahead. The house was the same as always, too large, too beige, too proud of itself. A faux colonial facade with white wraparound porches and stone columns that pretended at heritage. A home that photographed well but felt airless inside, like something bought off a showroom floor. Eleanor took the umbrella from the passenger seat and opened it halfway before the wind caught it, snapping two of the spokes inward with a sharp twang. One side collapsed instantly. She stood still for a moment, gripping the crooked handle, letting the useless thing dangle at her side. The rain had already begun to soak through her cardigan and into the shoulders of her blouse. She stepped carefully onto the flagstone path that led up to the front steps, her loafers squelching with each step. Her breath fogged faintly in front of her as she climbed the 3 stairs to the porch. She knocked once on the heavy double door, then twice more, sharper this time, her knuckles connecting with the polished wood that smelled faintly of lemon oil and cold metal. No answer. She waited. Seconds passed. A minute, maybe more. The porch light above her buzzed slightly, casting a pale halo that made the rain shimmer on the sleeve of her coat. Somewhere inside the house, faint music played. Jazz, maybe something from a streaming playlist. The sound of cutlery clinked softly. She knocked again, this time leaning in closer, pressing the side of her face toward the thin glass in the door's frame. That's when she saw her. Camille moved into view slowly, almost lazily, her outline backlit by the warm glow of the chandelier in the foyer. She was holding a large wine glass by the stem, her other hand loosely holding her phone. She didn't flinch when she saw her mother. In fact, she didn't look surprised at all. Instead, she tilted her head, raised the phone just slightly, as if to remind Eleanor it existed, and then shaped the words slowly with her mouth, not even bothering to open the door. Next time, call. Eleanor didn't react. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't knock again. She simply stared back, her face unreadable, the rain running down her cheeks like something that had been waiting years to fall. Her shoulders remained straight, though the fabric of her cardigan was now completely soaked, and her shoes had begun to stain darker at the toes. Camille held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned away without speaking, without smiling, without a hint of apology. The door remained closed. Eleanor stood there, not for 1 minute or 2, but for 12. She didn't shift her weight or adjust her coat. She didn't try calling Camille's phone or ringing the bell. She let the rain pour down over her hair, now plastered to her temples, and felt the cold seep in slowly, like ink spreading through fabric. She stayed until her breath turned shallow and her knees stiffened. Inside the house, she could see movement. Camille curled up now on the white sectional, legs tucked under her, the wineglass still in hand. She had moved on. Eleanor had not yet moved at all. When she finally turned, it wasn't with a dramatic spin or any bitter finality. She simply pivoted, stepped back down the path, and walked toward her car with the quiet deliberation of someone crossing a line they couldn't uncross. She opened the car door, sat carefully on the edge of the seat to avoid soaking it further, and closed the door with gentle precision. The umbrella was left behind, crumpled and forgotten, resting near the porch steps like a discarded relic of better manners. Eleanor didn't look back. Not at the house, not at the door, not at the window. She placed both hands on the steering wheel, paused for one breath, then signaled left, away from home, away from habit. She wasn't going home. Not yet. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the sky still looked swollen, like it hadn't yet decided whether to forgive the world. Eleanor Mercer woke early, earlier than habit required. Her house was quiet, too quiet without Daniel's snoring in the next room, without the kettle already whistling by the time she reached the kitchen. The coffee tasted metallic that morning, as if even the tap water had something bitter to add. She moved slowly but deliberately, each small motion, buttoning her coat, folding the umbrella's remains into the trash, carrying the clarity that had eluded her for months. The kind of clarity that arrives after humiliation has burned all the softness away. By 10 o'clock, she was seated in the warm leather chair across from Marcia Kent, her estate attorney. The office smelled faintly of cedar polish and printer ink, and the light filtering through the blinds cut thin bars across Marcia's desk. Eleanor sat upright, both hands resting on her handbag. Her cardigan was clean and pressed now, her hair combed into quiet order. Marcia adjusted her reading glasses and glanced up. "Eleanor, it's been a while. What brings you in this morning?" Eleanor reached into her purse and withdrew a thick, well-handled folder. It was bound with a faded red ribbon and labeled, in her tidy handwriting, "Estate Planning, Mercer Family." Her voice didn't shake when she spoke. "I need to make changes," she said. "Not revisions, removals." Marcia raised an eyebrow. "All right," she said carefully, opening the folder. "Then we'll start with the trust." The two women sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint hum of the heater beneath the window. Eleanor watched Marcia's manicured finger trace down the list of beneficiaries. When the finger paused at Camille Mercer Wells, Eleanor reached over, took a red pen from her own coat pocket, and drew one clean circle around the name. Then she set the pen down gently on the desk between them, as if marking a grave. Marcia's lips pressed into a thin line. Understood. No questions followed. That was one of the reasons Eleanor had always liked her. Marcia Kent believed in paperwork more than drama. They spent the next hour in meticulous quiet, reviewing documents, signing replacement forms, reassigning roles. Marcia drafted notes in neat columns: revise executor, revoke shared access, remove dual authority. Each word felt like the slow tightening of a seam that had once been frayed. When the last signature was done, Eleanor exhaled for the first time that morning. It wasn't relief exactly, more the satisfaction of a door finally closed. "Do you want a copy of the updated documents mailed or held for pickup?" Marcia asked. "Held," Eleanor replied. "I'll come back for them myself." Marcia hesitated for a moment, studying her client. "You're sure about this?" Eleanor nodded. "Absolutely." The attorney gave a brief, approving smile. "Then I'll have the drafts ready by Thursday." As Eleanor stood to leave, Marcia added softly, "You look steadier than I've seen you in years." Eleanor met her eyes and said, "That's because I've stopped trying to be welcome." That evening, as dusk folded itself over Franklin, Gwen Holbrook arrived unannounced, holding a thermos of soup and a face that saw more than it said. "You weren't at bridge this afternoon," Gwen began, stepping into the living room without waiting for permission. "So, either you were sick, or plotting something righteous? Eleanor smiled faintly. Both, I suppose. Gwen set the soup on the counter, pulled out a spoon, and leaned against the kitchen island. You've got that look again, she said. The one from when you sold Daniel's boat out from under him because he forgot your anniversary. That was strategic housekeeping, Eleanor replied evenly. Gwen tilted her head. And today? Eleanor took a seat at the table, her movements measured, the kind of grace born of long endurance. Today was maintenance, she said. She had a key. She chose the lock. Gwen studied her in silence for a moment. So, she finally said, what did you do? Eleanor slid a single sheet of paper across the table, the front page of her trust document. Camille's name circled in deep red ink. The color had bled slightly through to the back. Gwen gave a low whistle. You always did prefer ink to words. Eleanor smiled, a thin, tired curve of satisfaction. Words can be taken back. Ink can't. They spent the rest of the evening at the kitchen table, listing out what remained. The house, the lake cabin, 2 investment accounts, Daniel's pension, a small collection of antique watches, and a lifetime of careful savings. Gwen jotted notes as if auditing a museum inventory. When the list was finished, Eleanor leaned back, eyes half closed. It feels cleaner already, she murmured. Outside, rain began again, a light, polite drizzle tapping at the window panes. Gwen looked up from her notes. You all right with that sound? Eleanor watched the raindrops streak the glass, each one leaving a faint trail like the memory of motion. I am now, she said softly. This time, I'm the one inside. By Thursday morning, Eleanor had returned to Marcia's office wearing a navy wool coat, buttoned to the collar, and a pair of gloves she hadn't worn since Daniel's funeral. She carried no handbag, only a slim accordion file under one arm, and the expression of someone coming to sign something irreversible. Marcia Kent met her at the door with a quiet nod and gestured toward the inner office. The blinds were drawn against the bright Tennessee morning, and the room was hushed, save for the faint clatter of a printer finishing the last of the documents. The drafts are ready, Marcia said, her voice low and professional. Final copies, as requested. Eleanor sat without needing instruction. The leather chair creaked softly beneath her as she removed her gloves, one finger at a time, and set them beside the folder. Her hands, though lined with age, did not shake. She reached for the first document, the updated will, and began to read. Camille's name was no longer listed under heirs, no share percentages, no survivor clauses, no fallback beneficiary language. Gone. Troy's name didn't appear at all. Not once. Not in the main estate, nor in the contingent clauses, nor in the power of attorney agreements. There had been nothing to remove. He had never been trusted with anything to begin with. Marcia watched Eleanor's face as she flipped through the pages. No flicker of hesitation passed over her features. If anything, her eyes grew more focused as she moved from the will to the trust packet, then to the power of attorney document, where the previous designees had been formally struck through. In their place was a new line of succession. Primary medical power of attorney, Gwen Holbrook. Emergency contact, Gwen Holbrook. Executor of last wishes, Marcia Kent, with Gwen named as co-consultant. It was a fortress of quiet boundaries, airtight, emotionless, legal. Eleanor paused only once at the clause regarding Clara, the granddaughter who'd once asked to braid her hair at Christmas, who now responded to texts with cold, single-word replies. Still, Eleanor left her something. Not a free inheritance, but a future-bound key. Clara would receive access to a modest trust account, only upon enrollment in college, and only for educational expenses. No car purchases, no early withdrawals, no influence from her mother. It was, Eleanor thought, not a punishment, but a seed. if Clara chose to grow it. She turned to the final page. Marcia slid the pen toward her, weighted, gold-tipped, deliberate. "Are you ready?" she asked. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Instead, she smoothed the page gently with both hands, as though pressing the past out of it. Then, with slow precision, she picked up the pen and signed her name in full. No initials, no abbreviations. Just Eleanor A. Mercer. Once, twice, 3 times. The signatures were clean, centered, unshaken. When it was done, Marcia gathered the pages, stacked them neatly, and placed them inside a navy blue binder with a gold embossed seal. "I'll file the official copies with the county clerk by end of day. The originals. Do you want them stored here or taken home?" "Home," Eleanor said, rising. "They belong under my roof." Marcia hesitated, then opened a drawer and withdrew a square lockbox, steel gray, fireproof, and compact. "Take this. It's rated for 2 hours in a house fire. Combinations written on the back flap. I trust you'll remember to change it." Eleanor took the box and nodded once. "Thank you." As she turned to go, Marcia added gently, "You've done something most people never get around to." Eleanor paused. "What's that?" "Protecting your peace with paper. Most people wait until their silence has already cost them too much." Eleanor didn't smile, but her eyes held something steady, something finished. Some things are better locked away than left to interpretation. That night, in the center of her bedroom closet, behind a row of winter coats that hadn't seen daylight in years, Eleanor placed the fireproof box on a reinforced shelf. She dialed the new combination carefully, closed the lid, spun the dial. When she stepped back, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt fortified. Outside, the wind picked up again, rustling the oak trees that lined the edge of her property. The same wind that had once snapped her umbrella now felt distant, like an old threat she no longer feared. She turned off the light, walked down the hall, and let the silence spread like a freshly made bed. By Friday afternoon, the rain had passed for good. The November air smelled washed clean, sharp with pine and something faintly metallic from the gutters. From her kitchen window, Eleanor could see the corner of Camille's street a mile away, the route she no longer took, though habit still made her glance that direction when the mail truck went by. She never went back for the umbrella. It stayed there on Camille's porch, ribs bent, fabric sagging, a small monument to 12 quiet minutes that had rearranged her entire life. She let it remain exactly where it had fallen, the way one might leave a tombstone untouched. Instead, Eleanor turned her attention inward. For the first time in years, she moved through her house without rushing, letting her hands rest on the edges of furniture Daniel had built, and the picture frames that lined the hallway. Each object felt newly visible, as if the silence around her had sharpened its outline. She began choosing what belonged to memory and what belonged to motion. The next morning, she carried the first box to her car. Inside were 3 porcelain figurines from her grandmother's mantel, small, delicate things that Camille had once called dust magnets. Eleanor drove them to the local historical society and donated them anonymously. The woman behind the desk tried to take her name for the ledger, but Eleanor only smiled and said, "They'll know where they came from." That small act loosened something in her. Every day that week, she gathered another box, family photographs for Gwen's attic, Daniel's old fishing gear for the church fundraiser, her own wedding china delivered quietly to a neighbor's daughter about to be married. Each handoff lightened the rooms a little more. When Gwen stopped by midweek and saw the thinning shelves, she let out a low whistle. "Lord, Ellie, it looks like you're moving out." "I'm not," Eleanor said, sorting through silverware with methodical care. "Just editing." Gwen leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "She treated you like a nuisance. Now she'll learn you were the foundation." Eleanor's smile was small, but steady. Foundations don't argue with the house they hold up. They just decide when to stop carrying it. Later that afternoon, Eleanor drove to the bank. The lobby was nearly empty, its air conditioning still set for summer. She approached the counter and asked to close the joint checking account she'd opened with Camille years earlier, back when, just in case, had meant generosity, not access. The teller typed quietly, eyes flicking between screens, then slid a form across the counter. Eleanor signed it in slow, even strokes. When she walked back to her car, the balance receipt in her hand, she felt the kind of relief that has no audience. That night, she brewed chamomile tea and opened her laptop. A new message blinked in her inbox. Subject: College rec letter. It was from Clara. No greeting, no punctuation, just, "Can you send college recommendation?" Eleanor read it twice. The words were neutral, weightless, as though typed from another continent. She didn't reply. Instead, she forwarded the message to Gwen with a single line. "Handle as you see fit." Gwen's response arrived 10 minutes later. "Already drafting. I'll make sure she gets in somewhere worth the effort." Eleanor closed the laptop, slid it aside, and stared at the quiet reflection of herself in the kitchen window. She didn't feel anger anymore, only a careful stillness that came from knowing the storm had spent itself. 2 days later, she met with the notary at her dining table. Papers were arranged in careful stacks, and the air smelled faintly of lemon polish. Eleanor added Gwen's name to the secondary real estate deed, the small cabin near Lake Carter that Daniel had loved, but Camille had always called that moldy shack. As the notary stamped the final page, Eleanor felt a thin thread of warmth coil through her chest. Ownership, she thought, was sometimes just another word for witness. When the door closed behind the notary, the house returned to its usual stillness. Evening light slanted through the blinds, striping the hardwood floor in gold and shadow. Outside, a gust of wind lifted the last of the maple leaves from the yard and sent them tumbling down the street, past the mailbox, past the drive, toward the road that led to Camille's house. Eleanor watched them go, her hand resting on the edge of the table. She whispered, almost to herself, "Let her keep the umbrella. I've kept everything else that matters." The knock came just after 4 on a Sunday afternoon. 3 firm raps, evenly spaced, the kind that carried entitlement rather than question. Eleanor looked up from the kitchen sink where she'd been rinsing apples for a cobbler. Through the lace curtain, she could see a flash of camel-colored wool and a sleek car parked crookedly along the curb. Camille. For a long moment, Eleanor didn't move. The late sunlight pressed against the window panes, scattering across the counter where the notary's stamp still faintly indented a stack of papers from 2 days earlier. Her heart did not race. It simply steadied itself, like a clock ticking back into rhythm. She opened the door. Camille stood there holding a bottle of Chardonnay wrapped in gold foil and a smile rehearsed too many times in the mirror. "Hi, Mom." "Camille? Can I come in?" Eleanor stepped aside without speaking. The smell of rain from the lawn followed her daughter in, mingling with cinnamon and baked apples. Camille's heels clicked against the hardwood until she reached the kitchen doorway, and froze. On the table sat a simple china plate patterned with blue ivy leaves, the same set Camille had once called old lady porcelain. "Wow," Camille said lightly, "you finally brought out the good china. I used to think you were saving it for royalty." Eleanor wiped her hands on a towel. "Maybe I was." Camille laughed, too loudly. "Guess I'll have to do." She set the wine on the counter and looked around as though expecting someone else to appear. "You redecorated. It feels smaller." "It's quieter," Eleanor corrected. Camille perched on one of the chairs and crossed her legs. "Look, I probably should have called, but, well, I was driving by and thought, what the hell, right?" Eleanor only nodded. The tea kettle on the stove began to rumble, but she didn't move to pour it. Camille filled the silence. I was stressed that day, you know. The day at the house. You didn't call first, and Troy was dealing with those investors, and everything was chaotic. She gave a small shrug, eyes darting between the windows and her mother's face. I just didn't have the bandwidth for surprise visits. Eleanor leaned against the counter, hands folded neatly in front of her. You didn't ask if I was okay. Camille blinked. Well, you're fine, aren't you? Eleanor let the question hang in the air until the kettle whistled. She turned it off, not offering tea, just the sharp hiss of cooling steam. Legally? She said, her tone almost conversational. Better than ever. For the first time, Camille's smile faltered. What does that mean? It means everything's in order. Camille laughed again, but there was no air behind it. Oh God, you went to Marcia, didn't you? Please tell me you didn't do something dramatic. You're still upset about the rain thing? Mom, come on. It was 12 minutes. Eleanor tilted her head. It was long enough to measure character. Camille's expression hardened. You're overreacting. You've always taken things too far. Eleanor reached for the folder on the counter, unhurried, precise, and laid it flat on the table. The gold seal caught the afternoon light. Camille's eyes followed the motion, then flicked up in disbelief. What is that? Order, Eleanor said simply. For once. Camille stood, her chair scraping against the floor. You're telling me you actually changed the will? After everything Dad built for this family? After all I've done to keep it running? Eleanor looked at her evenly. You mean after all you've done to hollow it out? Camille's mouth opened, then closed again. The silence that followed was not empty. It was weighted, dense, the kind of silence that collects dust over years. Finally, Eleanor said, You always thought the house would be enough reason to come back. Now you'll have to find another one. Camille reached for the wine bottle, gripping it by the neck. You're being cruel. No, Eleanor replied. I'm being clear. Outside, wind rattled the loose gutter along the eaves, and somewhere down the street, a car door slammed. Camille's eyes glistened, but not from tears. Anger gleamed sharper than grief. This isn't over, she said. It's filed, Eleanor answered. That's the same thing. Camille hesitated at the doorway, her hand trembling on the knob. You'll regret this when I'm gone. Eleanor's voice was steady. You were gone long before the paperwork. Camille left without another word. The quiet that followed was thick enough to hear the ticking clock in the hallway and the faint pop of the cooling kettle. Eleanor exhaled, slow and measured, then sat down at the same table where Camille's perfume still lingered faintly in the air. She reached for the untouched wine bottle, read the label, and set it gently in the trash. Through the window, the first few drops of rain began again, hesitant but sure. She watched them trace the glass like signatures fading with time. Then the phone on the wall rang once, startling the quiet. Eleanor didn't move to answer. She only listened, knowing exactly who it was, and that this time, she didn't have to pick up. By Monday morning, the calm had turned brittle. Eleanor could feel it in the air of the kitchen, the way the clock ticked too loudly, the way the refrigerator hummed as if marking time between storms. The envelope she'd sent Saturday afternoon would have been delivered by now. The phone stayed silent until nearly noon. When it finally rang, the sound cut through the stillness like a blade through paper. Eleanor let it ring twice before answering. Camille didn't bother with greeting. What the hell is this? Eleanor set her coffee cup down on the saucer. Exactly what it says. You can't just erase me, Camille hissed, after everything I've done. Eleanor kept her tone even. You did the most damage in silence, Camille. I'm just putting that silence in writing. There was a sharp breath on the other end. Half laugh, half disbelief. You're out of your mind. People will think you're senile. Troy says we can contest. Eleanor interrupted softly. Troy says many things when he thinks there's a profit involved. The line went quiet for 3 beats. When Camille spoke again, her voice was lower, taut with fury. You're punishing me because I made one mistake. Eleanor looked toward the window, where the afternoon light fell in calm squares across the table. No, I'm correcting a pattern. You don't get to decide that. I already have. Camille made a sound, something between a scoff and a cry. Then the line went dead. Eleanor stared at the receiver for a long moment before returning it to its cradle. The kitchen filled again with the small, ordinary noises of her house, the slow tick of the clock, the creak of the settling floorboards, the kettle beginning to simmer on the stove. She waited a moment longer, then reached for her coat. At the county clerk's office, the waiting room smelled of toner and rain-soaked wool. A fan oscillated lazily behind the reception desk, stirring the smell of paper and damp umbrellas. Eleanor took a number, sat on a hard plastic chair, and watched people drift in and out. Contractors filing permits, young couples registering deeds, a woman holding a folder marked "Divorce? Final." When her turn came, she approached the counter and handed over the navy binder Marcia had prepared. I need to file this copy for public record, she said. The clerk, a woman not much older than Camille, flipped through the first few pages and glanced up. Estate documents? Yes. Certified? Every page. The woman nodded and began stamping each document with rhythmic precision. Thunk, slide, thunk. The sound was steady, satisfying, official. When the clerk was done, she returned the folder and offered a polite smile. All right, Mrs. Mercer, it's filed. Anything else? Eleanor shook her head. No, that's all. She walked out into the overcast afternoon, the faint smell of rain still clinging to the pavement. For the first time in weeks, her steps felt measured rather than heavy. That evening, the house was quiet again. Gwen dropped by briefly to bring back a casserole dish, noticed the stamped copies on the counter, and gave a knowing nod. I take it the ink's dry. Dry in public, Eleanor said. Gwen smiled. That's the best kind. They ate in companionable silence, the kind of silence that didn't need filling. When Gwen left, the sun had slipped below the trees, leaving a thin gold rim on the horizon. Eleanor poured herself a glass of water, turned off the kitchen light, and stood by the window. Across the street, porch lights blinked on one by one, like small confirmations of order in the world. Her phone buzzed once on the counter. A text message. She turned it over. From Clara. Wow. Just that. No punctuation, no follow-up. Eleanor stared at the word for a long moment, the glow of the screen reflecting in her glasses. She could almost hear the disbelief threaded through that single syllable, the distance between a granddaughter raised on convenience and a grandmother who had chosen consequence. She typed a reply, then erased it before sending. Some lessons, she thought, don't need narration. She powered off the phone, set it face down beside the sink, and let the darkness fold back around her. Outside, a car slowed briefly at the curb, headlights sweeping across the kitchen wall before continuing on. Eleanor didn't turn to look. She already knew whose car it was, and that the letter inside her daughter's glove box was now impossible to unread. The week that followed settled over Eleanor's house like a well-fitted lid, airtight, quiet, deliberate. Outside, the weather hovered between drizzle and mist, that Tennessee gray that never quite decides whether to rain or not. Inside, she kept her list on the kitchen table, each task written in neat blue ink, each box marked off only when complete. At the top of the page, under the date, she had written one word: locks. On Tuesday morning, she drove downtown to the bank, the same bank where she and Camille had once stood shoulder to shoulder, opening a just-in-case account. Smiling for the clerk, pretending it was about shared trust rather than insurance against disappointment. The same marble floors, the same overeager greeter by the door. Only now the warmth had drained from the memory. She approached the counter. "I need to close a joint account," she said. "The other party has been notified." The teller, a young man with polite eyes, nodded and asked for her ID. Eleanor handed it over, along with the thin folder she'd brought. Inside were signatures, verification letters, and a copy of her amended trust. Everything tidy. Final. He typed quickly. "Mrs. Mercer, there's still a balance. Would you like that transferred to your personal account?" "No," she said. "Withdrawn. In a cashier's check." As he counted out the paperwork, she studied the marble floor, thinking of all the years she'd mistaken courtesy for care. The machine whirred, spitting out the check like an ending printed in black ink. When he slid it across the counter, Eleanor smiled faintly. "Thank you," she said. "I prefer my name standing alone." From there, she walked 2 blocks to the brokerage office. The receptionist recognized her, offered coffee, but Eleanor declined. "I'm here to update access permissions," she told the account manager when he appeared. "I need all third-party authorizations removed." He blinked. "All of them?" "Yes," she said, handing over her portfolio. "Everyone." The man hesitated, scanning the forms. "We can keep you as sole signatory, of course. Do you want to name a successor trustee?" She smiled, polite but firm. "Already done. Filed and certified." He nodded, typed a few commands, then pushed the paperwork forward for her signature. She signed once, twice, 3 times, each stroke slow and intentional. When she left, the sky had started to lighten, thin sunlight flickering off the glass towers downtown. Eleanor took that as a small sign, proof that some clarity can only arrive after erasure. That evening, Gwen stopped by with a folder of her own and 2 cups of takeout chowder. "Marcia called," she said, laying the folder on the table. "Said we should wrap the trust before month's end. You ready to finish the fortress?" Eleanor took the pen from her friend's hand. "Ready." Together they went through the remaining pages, line items, addenda, codicils. Every clause that had once carried Camille's name now bore new instructions, each one carefully worded to protect rather than punish. Gwen read aloud in her dry school-teacher cadence while Eleanor initialed every margin. By the time they reached the last document, Gwen looked up. "You realize," she said softly, "this is you building the life you should have had 20 years ago." Eleanor capped the pen, set it down, and leaned back. "They locked the door once," she said. "I've locked everyone since." Gwen nodded. "That's how you keep the peace. You don't slam it, you seal it." 2 days later, Marcia herself came by to collect the signed copies. She checked every page with the precision of someone who lived by commas. "Everything looks perfect," she said, slipping the papers into a labeled envelope. "You've built a wall no one can climb." "It's not a wall," Eleanor replied. "It's a choice of who gets in." Marcia smiled at that, professional pride mixed with quiet respect, and left with the envelope tucked under her arm. The house was silent again after the door closed. Sunlight poured through the lace curtains, dust motes shifting like fine gold particles in the air. Eleanor sat down at her writing desk, took out a single sheet of stationery, and began to write in her small, perfect script. "Clara, doors open from both sides. One day you'll understand which side you're standing on." She folded the note neatly, sealed it in an envelope, and addressed it in longhand. No return address, only her initials on the back flap. When she set the pen down, the room felt lighter, like air after rain, clear and exact. She turned off the lamp, slipped the envelope into her coat pocket, and walked it to the mailbox at the end of the street. The metal slot clanged shut with a satisfying finality. Eleanor stood there a moment longer, breathing the cold night air. The quiet was deep enough to hear her own heartbeat. And somewhere far off, faint thunder rolled again across Franklin. It began, as so many modern humiliations do, with a post. Eleanor found it on a Tuesday morning, sent by Gwen with nothing more than the message, "You'd better see this before the coffee cools." She clicked the link, the glow of the laptop washing her lined face in pale light. There it was. Camille's familiar handwriting rendered in digital script, her grief trimmed and edited for sympathy. "Sometimes we lose parents long before they're gone. I tried everything. Money, time, forgiveness. Some people can't be helped." Beneath the text sat a photograph, Camille smiling against the backdrop of her manicured garden, a glass of wine in hand. 78 likes, 3 comments about toxic boundaries. Eleanor read it twice, her lips pressed thin. The room was quiet except for the ticking clock and the faint rustle of the oak outside her window. Then she took a slow breath, reached for the keyboard, and pressed print. The printer hummed to life, spooling out the evidence. She clipped the page to a manila folder labeled Family Communications, slid it inside, and closed the drawer of the filing cabinet with the same precision she used to seal legal documents. Some words, she thought, deserved permanence, not conversation. That afternoon, she met Marcia at the law office. The attorney glanced at the printout, her eyes narrowing only slightly before setting it aside. "Would you like me to include a no-contact provision in your file?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "Make it formal." Marcia scribbled a note, efficient as ever. "I'll draft a polite version, firm but without invitation." "Good. Polite vengeance is still vengeance." Marcia allowed herself a smile. "I'll have the letter certified by morning." When Eleanor returned home, Gwen was waiting at the kitchen table, glasses perched low on her nose, a legal pad open in front of her. "We need to put something down for your legacy letter," she said. "Not the will, something human. A summation." Eleanor set her purse aside, poured them both tea, and sat. "What's left to say?" Gwen looked up. "Whatever's still unsaid tends to echo." They worked in silence for several minutes, Gwen drafting lines in her teacher's script, Eleanor revising with the economy of someone who'd learned the danger of excess. When they were done, Gwen read the closing aloud. "You loved convenience. I needed care. We each chose what was easier." Eleanor nodded once. "That will do." That night, she opened a file on her computer titled Obituary, Draft. The version Daniel had written years ago still listed "Beloved Daughter, Camille Mercer Wells." Eleanor hovered over the keyboard, her hand steady. She backspaced slowly until the name disappeared, the cursor blinking in the cleared space like a breath she no longer owed anyone. She replaced it with a single sentence. "She is survived by friends who became family." She reread it, felt the truth settle into her bones, and hit save. Her phone buzzed the next evening. A new text from Clara. "Are you really cutting Mom out?" Eleanor stared at the words, at the bluntness of youth that still believed everything could be negotiated. She thought of the umbrella left on Camille's porch, the bank accounts closed, the letter sealed in the county clerk's archive. She typed back, "I'm cutting off what hurt." The reply came a minute later. "Guess that includes me then." Eleanor let the screen dim without answering. Somewhere deep in her chest, something ached. Not regret exactly, but recognition. Some inheritances, she thought, travel invisibly through generations, the urge to win a silence rather than understand it. The next morning, the sky broke open again, sunlight streaming through after days of gray. She poured herself coffee, walked to the study, and opened the file drawer where she kept everything important. The folder labeled Family Communications now contained a single printed page, the post, frozen in ink, stripped of its audience. Eleanor ran her fingertips over the smooth paper, then slid it back into place. When she closed the drawer, the click was soft but final. The world would keep spinning its versions, its narratives of heartbreak and blame. She didn't need to correct them anymore. She stepped outside, mug in hand, the morning air crisp and clear. Across the street, a neighbor waved from her porch, and Eleanor waved back, small and sure. For a moment she thought she heard her phone buzz inside the house. Another message, another plea. But she left it where it was. Some posts didn't deserve answers. Some stories were stronger when you let them end in silence. The invitation arrived wrapped in soft ivory paper, its corners sealed with gold foil like a peace offering that didn't quite know what it was apologizing for. Eleanor found it in her mailbox one quiet December morning, wedged between a utilities bill and a church newsletter. The envelope was addressed in Camille's careful calligraphy, loops deliberate, performance polished. Inside was an embossed card bordered in evergreen and holly. Annual Wells Family Christmas Brunch, it read. Date, time, location. Below, in smaller print, please RSVP by December 12th. At the bottom, the hostess's name gleamed in cursive gold, Camille Mercer Wells. Eleanor stood in the entryway for a long time, the weight of the paper strangely heavy in her hands. The smell of cinnamon drifted from the kitchen where she'd been steeping tea. Through the window, the neighborhood glittered faintly with frost. It was, she thought, the kind of morning people wrote holiday letters about. Glowing, curated, insincere. She sat at the kitchen table, smoothed the card flat, and stared at the blank line beneath attending regrets. Then she folded the RSVP neatly in half, slid it back into its envelope, and wrote across the front in steady block letters. No longer at this address. She sealed it, pressed her thumb over the flap until the glue caught, and laid it beside her teacup. The decision felt clean. By afternoon, her phone vibrated. A text from Camille. Don't make a scene. Eleanor typed back without hesitation. You already did. 3 dots blinked, disappeared, blinked again. Then nothing. The stillness that followed wasn't relief. It was confirmation. The week of Christmas came quickly, cold and bright. Gwen arrived early that Saturday, her car trunk filled with mismatched teacups, cranberry scones, and a garland she'd rescued from her attic. I thought we'd host our own little rebellion, she said, unloading tins onto the counter. A holiday that doesn't require forgiveness as a dress code. Eleanor smiled faintly. Tea for the survivors. They set the table with white linen and the good china. Eleanor's china, blue ivy leaves shining under the winter light. By noon, 3 friends from Bridge had joined them, women with silver hair and sharp humor who understood the comfort of polite exclusion. Conversation stayed light. Books, the mayor's latest speech, the rising price of sugar. But beneath it all ran a quiet warmth, the kind born of people who had stopped performing for their families. When the clock chimed 2, Gwen poured another round of Darjeeling and said softly, You know, Ellie, this feels more like Christmas than any I can remember. Eleanor nodded. Because no one here expects to be forgiven. They laughed, gentle and unguarded, and for the first time in months, the house felt truly lived in. That evening, after the guests had gone and the dishes were drying on the rack, Eleanor noticed a small parcel on the porch, a simple brown box tied with silver ribbon. There was no return label, no card tucked beneath the bow. She carried it inside, set it on the sideboard, and studied it for a long time. The handwriting on the shipping label was familiar, almost careful enough to disguise itself. Clara. Eleanor ran her finger along the ribbon but didn't pull it free. The box was light, perhaps a candle, perhaps something symbolic. But she found she had no curiosity left to spare. Some gifts, she thought, arrive only to test your restraint. She placed it on the highest shelf of the bookcase, beside Daniel's watch and the unplayed piano music from their wedding. The ribbon caught the lamplight like a question deferred. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the bare branches against the window. Eleanor poured herself a final cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, the empty chair across from her reflecting faintly in the window's dark glass. Somewhere in town, she imagined Camille's brunch in full swing, guests laughing, crystal clinking, her daughter performing Serenity for an audience that didn't know the script had changed. She lifted her teacup in a quiet toast, to no one and everyone. To peace, she whispered, and to its cost. A moment later, her phone buzzed once more. A new message preview lit the screen. Check your mail tomorrow. You'll regret ignoring me. Eleanor read it, exhaled, and turned the phone face down. Outside, snow had begun to fall, fine, deliberate flakes landing on the mailbox, softening its hard edges. She watched until the white covered everything visible, even the path leading back to the street she no longer claimed. The snow from Christmas lingered longer than expected. Thin crusts of ice clinging to rooftops and curbs like old arguments unwilling to melt. Eleanor moved through the house in slippers, careful on the wood floors, the cold following her from room to room. She hadn't opened the box from Clara. It sat high on the shelf, collecting dust and possibility in equal measure. That morning, she met with her physician, Dr. Harding, a man who had treated her for 15 years and still spoke to her as though she were a colleague rather than a patient. His office smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. "So," he said, tapping his pen against her file, "you're asking for a competency evaluation. You're not showing any decline. Eleanor, why the formal proof?" "Because people mistake age for weakness," she replied. "And sometimes they weaponize concern." Harding gave a knowing nod. "This about Camille?" Eleanor didn't answer. She simply folded her hands on her lap and waited. After a moment, he smiled. "Then let's get this documented." An hour later, she walked out with a signed statement of full cognitive function. Print, signature, seal. Clear-headed, lucid, and legally fit. Her next stop was Marcia's office. The lawyer looked up from a stack of files as Eleanor entered, brushing snow from her coat sleeve. "Back so soon?" "Preventative maintenance," Eleanor said, handing over the envelope. "I need this filed with the trust." Marcia skimmed the document, nodding in quiet satisfaction. "Competency report from your physician. That's smart." She opened a second drawer, retrieved another file, and slipped the pages inside. "This should preempt any claims of diminished capacity if Camille decides to contest the estate," Marcia said. "It'll shut down the argument before it starts." "That's the idea." Marcia leaned back in her chair. "You know, Eleanor, most of my clients act defensively when their children turn on them. You're the only one who treats it like architecture." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Houses fall apart when you ignore the foundation." That evening, Gwen arrived with a casserole and her usual blend of humor and blunt wisdom. "She's not worried you're unstable," she said between bites. "She's worried you're prepared." Eleanor poured them both tea, her expression unreadable. "Preparation looks like defiance to people who profit from your confusion," Gwen chuckled. "If I ever end up on your bad side, remind me to move states." They ate quietly for a while, the clink of forks against porcelain the only sound. Then Eleanor reached for a folder at the end of the table and opened it. "I've been updating the burial directives," she said. "No planning involvement from Camille, not a word, not a flower." Gwen looked up, eyebrows arched. "You're serious?" Eleanor's tone was calm, measured. She once said funerals were just pageants for the living. I'm taking her at her word. Gwen smiled, though her eyes softened. "You really are building peace from the paperwork out." Eleanor exhaled, a long, slow breath that clouded faintly in the cool air. Peace doesn't build itself. Later that night, when Gwen had gone and the house had settled back into its hush, Eleanor sat in her armchair with the fire dying low. The phone buzzed on the side table, an unfamiliar number, but she didn't need to check. The text read, "This is getting out of hand. Clara." Eleanor stared at the screen for a long moment, watching the words blur slightly in the flicker of firelight. She could almost hear her granddaughter's voice, half exasperation, half fear, echoing the tone Camille once used when she was young and still believed control meant love. She typed back slowly. "Because I refused to stay quiet?" There was no reply. She placed the phone face down, listening to the wind press against the windows like an impatient visitor. The clock ticked on the mantel, steady and unhurried. She thought of the sealed envelope in Marcia's files, of Dr. Wayne Harding's signature, of all the small fortifications she'd built piece by piece. They weren't weapons, they were proofs. Proof that she was here, that she was clear, that silence, chosen carefully, could speak louder than grief ever did. When she rose to close the curtains, she caught her reflection in the glass. Tired, yes, but certain. The face of a woman her daughter had underestimated one too many times. January thawed slow and reluctant. The snow turned to slush at the curbs. The sky hung low and pewter-colored, and the air outside Eleanor's house carried the smell of wet pine and chimney smoke. The box from Clara had begun to bother her, not by what it contained, but by the way it waited. That morning, she took it down from the shelf, wiped a thin film of dust from the lid, and carried it to the porch. The wood was cold beneath her slippers. She set the box gently beside the doormat, exactly where the mailman would see it. Unopened, unclaimed. She stood for a moment, watching her breath fog in the air. Then she turned the handle, went back inside, and locked the door behind her. When Gwen arrived later that afternoon, cheeks pink from the wind and arms full of grocery bags, she noticed the box immediately. "You're just leaving it out there?" "Yes." Eleanor poured 2 cups of tea. Gwen leaned toward the window. "Sometimes they try to undo it with symbols, you know. A token, a ribbon, a way to feel absolved without saying anything." Eleanor set the cups down on the table and met her friend's eyes, but never with truth. For a long while they sat without speaking, the steam from the cups curling into the stillness between them. Finally, Gwen said, "So what happens now?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "Now I write something that can't be edited with a post." That evening, she settled at her desk in the den, the same place Daniel had once balanced checkbooks and drafted letters to clients who still believed in fountain pens. The fire in the grate burned low, steady, its glow pooling across the paper as she began to write. "Clara, you will be 30 when you read this, and I'll have been gone some years. By then you'll know that apologies often arrive wrapped as explanations, and both mean very little without change." Her pen moved slowly, each word weighted with the patience she had never been granted in conversation. "You inherited your mother's strength, but you've used it as armor instead of anchor. If you ever decide to grow roots, plant them somewhere. Kindness is currency." She paused, listening to the wind shift through the gutters. Then she wrote the last line. "Love isn't owed, it's chosen. And it's never proven by who forgives first." She signed only her initials, folded the pages, and sealed them in a cream envelope. On the front she wrote, "To be delivered on her 30th birthday." When Gwen dropped by the next morning, Eleanor handed her the envelope. "For Marcia," she said. "Legacy packet." Gwen turned it over carefully. "Another lock?" "A door," Eleanor corrected. "She can decide whether to open it." By the end of the week, Marcia called to confirm receipt. "It's archived," she said. "Along with your directives and letters of instruction, everything's airtight." Eleanor thanked her, then paused. "There's one more thing." She withdrew a folded check from her planner and slid it across the desk. "A donation to the women's shelter on Elm." Marcia glanced at the memo line and raised an eyebrow. You want it recorded under Mercer? Camille Mercer, Eleanor said. Her maiden name. Let her name do something decent for once. Marcia smiled. You always find the poetic clause. It's not poetry, Eleanor replied. It's symmetry. That night, the porch light cast a narrow glow over the steps. The box still sat there, ribbon now damp and frayed from the weather. A thin layer of frost had formed along the edges. Eleanor opened the door just long enough to move it closer to the railing, out of her way, but visible to anyone passing by. A quiet reminder that not every gesture deserved an audience. Back inside, she sank into her chair by the fire, a blanket draped over her knees. The flames popped softly, a comforting punctuation to the silence she had chosen and earned. On the mantel, the clock ticked past midnight. She thought of the letter resting safely in Marcia's vault, of Clara one day reading it with adult eyes, and of Camille somewhere out there, mistaking noise for relevance. Eleanor closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she slept easily. The knock came just before dawn. Soft, uncertain, the kind of sound made by someone testing whether forgiveness might still be asleep. Eleanor woke instantly. The house was wrapped in that pale blue half-light that blurs edges and makes everything look like memory. She sat up, listened. Another knock, faintly louder this time. She slipped into her robe, tightened the belt, and walked down the hall. Through the frosted glass of the front door, a silhouette waited. Tall, coat collar turned up, shoulders rigid. For one suspended moment, she almost convinced herself it was Daniel. Then the figure shifted, and she saw the outline of a woman's purse strap slung across one arm. Camille. Eleanor unlocked the door, but instead of stepping aside, she stepped out. The air was cold enough to sting, the porch slick with dew. She pulled the door closed behind her until it latched, leaving the warmth of the house sealed off. Camille's breath hung visibly between them. You could have at least called before locking me out of your life, she said, her voice trembling, not from cold, but from control fighting to hold. Eleanor didn't answer. Camille took a hesitant step forward, arms lifting slightly as though muscle memory were reaching for an embrace. Don't make this dramatic, Mom. I didn't come to fight. When she moved closer, Eleanor stayed still. She didn't recoil, but she didn't move either. The distance between them, 2 feet of cold air, was older than either of them could admit. Camille let her arms drop. You're really not going to hug me? Eleanor's eyes flicked to the driveway, where the same black sedan idled with its engine running. You brought Troy, she said quietly. He's waiting in the car. I told him I could handle this. Eleanor folded her arms, the morning chill settling in her sleeves. You can't handle what you refuse to name. Camille's mouth tightened. Don't do this over one rainy day. Eleanor's voice came evenly without bitterness. It wasn't the rain. It was the wave. Camille frowned. The what? The wave, Eleanor repeated, her gaze steady. You waved at me through the glass while I stood outside like a stranger. That's the moment I stopped trying to explain myself to people who already decided not to listen. Camille shook her head, letting out a nervous laugh. You're being petty. I'm being precise. For a long moment there was only the soft hum of the idling car and the faint rustle of the neighbor's wind chimes. Camille's face shifted. Anger first, then hurt, then a flicker of desperation. I don't want this to end like some cold legal thing, she said. You've turned into someone I don't even recognize. Eleanor took a slow breath. You never tried to. That's not fair. Camille's voice cracked on the last word. You've frozen everyone out. Clara's scared to even call you. You're punishing me through her. Eleanor's tone softened slightly. Clara isn't the punishment. She's the proof there's still something worth leaving behind clean. Camille blinked hard, a tear sliding down her cheek before she brushed it away too fast, too angry for vulnerability. You'll die alone with your papers and your lawyer. That's what you've built. Walls made of signatures. Eleanor tilted her head, almost pitying. Walls can't hurt anyone. People can. Camille's lips parted, but no words came. The cold wind carried between them, stirring the porch light's chain. Finally, Eleanor spoke again, quieter now. Go home, Camille. Camille swallowed hard. And if I don't? Then I'll call Marcia, Eleanor said, almost kindly. She handles my boundaries now. Something in that sentence broke the last of Camille's composure. She turned, walked down the steps without another word, her heels clicking sharply against the wet pavement. Eleanor waited until the car pulled away before unlocking the door. The house greeted her with warmth, with order. She closed the door and leaned against it for a long moment, eyes closed. Outside, the early light brightened the frost on the porch railing. Where Camille had stood, a faint impression of her shoe prints melted slowly into the boards. Eleanor whispered to the empty air, "That's all that ever stays." Then she turned the lock, once, firmly, and went to make coffee. By mid-February, Franklin thawed into mud. The snow had given up, the sky turned dull pewter, and the gutters dripped steadily like leaky clocks. Eleanor sat in Marcia Kent's office once more. Same leather chair. Same wall of legal diplomas that gleamed like medals from quieter wars. "I've reviewed everything," Marcia said, sliding a final document across the desk. "This clause makes it absolute. No contest, no reinstatement, no conditional re-entry. Once you sign, Camille Mercer Wells is permanently revoked as heir, executor, and trustee. It can't be undone." Eleanor studied the page, the ink dark and decisive. "Good," she said. "Let's make it official." Marcia turned the document so it faced her client and clicked the pen open. "It's rare, you know. Most people leave a back door, some emotional fine print in case guilt comes calling." "Back doors invite drafts," Eleanor said. "I'm cold enough as it is." She read the text carefully, tracing each line with her fingertip. Every sentence was a lock, every signature a sealed door. When she reached the paragraph titled Revocation and Exclusion, she paused, not from doubt, but from the strange calm of completion. She signed her name, each letter deliberate, ending with a long, steady line that cut across the page like a horizon. Marcia initialed the margins, affixed her seal, and folded the document neatly into the master binder. "Congratulations," she said softly. "You've just crossed your last line." Eleanor smiled, faint but certain. "For good," she said. The next afternoon, Gwen arrived to help with what she jokingly called the ceremonial sealing of the vault. The kitchen smelled of lemon oil and paper dust. Ellie's two constants these days. "You're really closing the book on her," Gwen said, flipping through the updated binder. "Every signature in place, every clause accounted for. Even your funeral plans." Eleanor nodded. "I added one detail." Gwen squinted. "Immediate family to be seated front row, defined by love, not blood." She looked up, eyes glinting. "You know, that might be the best sentence you've ever written." "It's the truest," Eleanor said. They shared a quiet laugh, the kind that carried both relief and mourning. Then Gwen's gaze fell on another document, the addendum with Clara's name. "What's this?" "Conditional scholarship clause," Eleanor said. "Clara will inherit enough to finish college, if she graduates. Not before. I'm leaving her potential, not pity." Gwen smiled, though her eyes softened. "She'll understand one day." Eleanor poured them each a cup of tea. "If she doesn't, she'll have the choice to learn. That's all I ever wanted for either of them." Gwen leaned back, arms crossed. "And for me?" Eleanor opened a separate envelope and slid a single sheet across the table. "Co-survivor deed. If I go first, the house is yours. No probate, no court, just keys. For once, Gwen was speechless. Ellie? Are you sure? Eleanor nodded. You've already lived here in every way that matters. You kept me upright when the house leaned. Gwen reached across the table, covered Eleanor's hand with hers. I don't know whether to thank you or cry. Neither, Eleanor said gently. Just water the garden when spring comes. That evening, as twilight turned the living room to soft amber, Eleanor sat at her desk for what she knew would be the final entry. She opened her notebook, the same one she'd started the night Camille locked her out, and wrote a single sentence across the first blank page. You left me in the rain. I've dried off and moved on. She tore the page free, folded it once, and slipped it into the front of the binder between the legal clauses and signatures. Then she sealed the envelope with a strip of wax, pressing Daniel's old signet ring into it until the imprint set. A small circle marked with the letter M. When the wax cooled, she held the envelope in both hands for a moment, feeling its weight. Not heavy, but exact. This, she murmured, is how silence stays earned. She placed it in the fireproof box in her closet, turned the dial 3 times, and listened for the click that meant closure. Outside, the air carried the faint promise of spring. Down the street, church bells rang the hour. Gwen's car headlights swung across the window as she left, but Eleanor didn't wave. She sat by the fire instead, her reflection steady in the glass. No longer the woman standing in the rain, but the one who built her own shelter afterward. The fire popped once, scattering a brief shower of sparks. Eleanor smiled faintly and whispered, "Legacy sealed." Then, from somewhere deep in the night, a car door slammed. Her smile faded. She rose slowly, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the crunch of tires on gravel. She turned off the lamp and stood in the dark, waiting, as the beam of headlights crept up her driveway and stopped at the gate. The next morning dawned soft and colorless, the kind of Tennessee morning that sits halfway between winter and spring. A low fog clung to the Mercer garden, wrapping every boxwood and stone path in a gauzy stillness. Eleanor pulled on Daniel's old coat, too big through the shoulders, frayed at the cuffs, and stepped outside. The ground was damp beneath her boots, the earth pliant from thaw. The garden he'd planted decades ago was still sleeping. Bare rose canes, skeletal hydrangeas, the faint green tips of early daffodils pushing through cold soil. Eleanor followed the brick path to the back gate, her breath rising in faint white ribbons. She stopped beside the oak where Daniel had once strung a swing for Camille, where, years later, he'd built the bench they used to share on evenings too quiet for television. The wood was moss-dark now, but sturdy. She sat down slowly, her gloved hands folded in her lap. "I did what you'd have done," she whispered into the morning air. Maybe slower, but cleaner. A robin flitted down, pecking at the ground near her boot. Somewhere beyond the fence, a neighbor's wind chime answered the breeze with a few soft notes, and for the first time in months, the sound didn't feel like intrusion. When she rose again, the hem of her coat brushed against the wet grass. She walked the perimeter once more before heading back inside, feeling the weight of years turn lighter with every step. By mid-afternoon, she sat in Marcia Kent's office for what she promised would be the final time. The lawyer handed her a printed sheet across the desk. "Last item on your list," she said. "Your obituary draft." Eleanor adjusted her glasses and read slowly, mouthing each word as though testing its truth. Eleanor A. Mercer, beloved friend, mentor, and neighbor. Survived by Gwen Holbrook, her constant companion in life and in laughter. Camille's name wasn't there. Clara's appeared once, only as granddaughter, student. Marcia waited. "You're comfortable with this version?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "It tells the truth without ceremony." Marcia smiled. Then I'll file it along with the estate packet. Franklin Gazette will keep it on record. They signed the final copy. The pen left no hesitation in the line. 2 days later, she met Gwen at the bank downtown. The air inside smelled of brass polish and paper currency, that faint hum of commerce that never truly slept. A young clerk escorted them to the vault, guiding them through a narrow hallway until they reached a private room lined with safety boxes. Gwen carried the thick manila envelope. Eleanor held the smaller, fireproof binder that contained everything that mattered now. "This is it," Gwen murmured. Eleanor nodded. "Everything that was still open is now closed." The clerk spun the dial, opened the metal door, and stepped aside. Eleanor slid the binder onto the middle shelf. Its spine glimmered faintly under the fluorescent light, the gold lettering catching one last reflection before the door shut. When the lock clicked, she felt the echo deep in her chest. Not pain, exactly, just the confirmation of weight transferred. Later that afternoon, they drove home in near silence. The trees along Main Street were bare but already studded with buds. At a red light, Gwen glanced over. "You know," she said softly, "this is the most peaceful you've looked in years." Eleanor turned her face toward the window, watching a pair of children run across a patch of half-melted snow. "Letting go," she said, "is lighter than carrying hope." Gwen reached for her hand across the console. "Then don't pick it back up." "I won't." They drove the rest of the way in silence, the kind that didn't need mending. Back home, dusk spilled through the windows in long amber streaks. Eleanor lit a single candle on the mantel and sat by the fire. On the side table lay a copy of the final obituary, folded, neat, complete. She traced her finger along the crease and felt only steadiness. Camille's name never appeared again in any document, any drawer label. Her presence, once loud and demanding, had gone quiet, erased not in vengeance, but in precision. Eleanor leaned back, eyes closed, listening to the crackle of the fire. The room smelled faintly of cedar and lemon oil, the scent of finished work. Outside, wind moved through the garden, carrying the soft rustle of branches and, beneath it, the faint rhythm of footsteps that didn't belong to memory. She opened her eyes. Through the window, the front gate swung once, then stilled. Eleanor rose, candlelight flickering behind her, and listened to the silence that followed, thick, waiting, undecided. The morning rain returned like a memory repeating itself. Soft, insistent, impossible to ignore. It wasn't the punishing downpour of that other day. It was gentler now, a steady percussion against the porch roof, a rhythm of closure rather than warning. Inside, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with the final document spread before her, the completed estate binder. Every clause, every witness line, every signature had been reviewed, initialed, filed, and certified. Only one blank remained, her confirmation at the bottom of the last page. She adjusted her glasses, uncapped the pen, and let it rest against the paper for a heartbeat. The room smelled faintly of coffee and cedar polish, the scent of diligence. The clock ticked behind her in even measure. When she signed, the sound was barely audible. The soft glide of ink over parchment, the closing of an era written in her own hand. She dotted the final I, then leaned back and released a slow breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For a moment, she simply looked at the page. Then she flipped the cover shut and ran her palm along the binder's spine, feeling the raised gold letters of her name. It felt less like victory than completion. Solid, deliberate, earned. She reached for a cream envelope, larger than the others, and wrote across it in her neat, slanted script, "Final." No addendums. The ink bled slightly at the edges, dark and permanent. By early afternoon, the clouds had settled into a patient drizzle. Eleanor carried the binder to the porch, set it on the small table beside her chair, and opened a new umbrella, navy blue, its ribs strong and straight. She tilted it just enough to keep the rain off her lap and sat down. From this vantage, the garden glistened, each leaf trembling under the soft weight of water. The oak bench Daniel had built shone dark with moisture. The swing, unused for years, creaked faintly in the breeze. Gwen arrived not long after, a thermos of tea in one hand, her coat buttoned up to her chin. "I half expected you to be napping," she said, stepping onto the porch. "But of course you're signing something instead." Eleanor smiled. "Old habits. I finally finished the binder." Gwen poured the tea into 2 porcelain cups she'd brought from her own cupboard. Mismatched, but warm. "You really did it," she said. "Every dotted I, every crossed T. You've built a peace contract." Eleanor nodded, eyes on the rain. "Peace has to be written down, or people start editing it." They sipped in silence, the kind that didn't need translation. The rain drummed gently on the umbrella above them, a sound that no longer carried humiliation, only rhythm, only presence. On the small table between them sat an unopened envelope, the letter to Clara, returned by the lawyer for safekeeping. Its seal remained intact, its edges unbent. The paper looked lighter now, as though it knew it would keep its secrets until the right time. Gwen noticed it and nodded toward it. "You keeping that close on purpose?" "I suppose," Eleanor said. "Some things need time, others need closure." Gwen smiled into her cup. "And you've had both." "Eventually," Eleanor said. They listened to the rain a little longer. A robin darted under the porch rail, shaking water from its feathers before disappearing into the hedge. Across the street, the church bell struck 3, its tone rounding out the edges of the gray afternoon. Eleanor leaned back, letting the umbrella tilt slightly so she could feel a fine mist against her face. The droplets were cool, but not unkind. She thought of how far she'd come from that first storm, the one that had left her shivering outside her daughter's house, dignity soaked through. Now the water felt different, not a punishment, but a baptism into ownership of her own silence. Gwen reached for her coat pocket, produced a single sugar cookie wrapped in wax paper, and set it beside Eleanor's cup. "For the record," she said, "if anyone deserves a victory treat, it's you." Eleanor laughed softly. "I'll take it as evidence." They sat until the rain softened to a whisper, until the world smelled clean again. Then Eleanor folded her hands in her lap, eyes on the horizon. "My daughter locked me out in the rain," she said quietly, almost as if telling the story to the sky itself. "So I locked her out of the will." The words didn't sound like revenge. They sounded like peace, earned letter by letter. She closed the umbrella halfway, letting the last few drops touch her face. Across the table, Gwen raised her cup in a small, unspoken toast. Eleanor met her eyes and smiled, steady, unshaken, complete. The binder beside her stayed sealed. It didn't need to be opened again.